a cold, cold place, and I ain't got a dime to my name. Detroit's a cold, hard place, and I ain't got.
After the Great Crash, America had officially entered the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a period between 1929 and 1940 in which the United States economy plummeted and unemployment soared. It was caused by 4 factors. Tariffs and war debt cut down the sale of U.S. exports, the farming crisis of low prices, debt, and foreclosure, the availability of easy credit, and unequal distribution of income.
It's important to note that the Great Depression was not just felt in the United States, but felt everywhere around the world. By 1930, the world economy was broken, and every nation was hit hard. The European powers, recovering from World War I, were severely hurt. U.S. buyers couldn't afford European imports, and European economies crumbled. Likewise, Europe couldn't buy U.S. goods. Nations who owed war debt no longer had the means to pay them off. Nations who were owed money, like the United States, wouldn't be paid back the money that they heavily relied on. Currency values plummeted everywhere around the world. Prices rose, and unemployment soared.
The Depression hit the United States extremely hard. By 1932, high costs and low revenue had driven 90,000 businesses bankrupt. Workers' wages and hours were cut in half. Consumerism slowed to a trickle as consumers faced high prices for the basics. As U.S. industry collapsed, the United States unemployment rate jumped to 25%. No work meant certain starvation, homelessness, and no income to get by on.
U.S. businesses weren't the only institutions that suffered heavily. U.S. banks also were hit extremely hard by the Depression. By 1933, almost half of the country's banks had failed. Millions had lost all that they had, and others had nowhere to protect what they had left. Banks are an extremely important part of the economy, and without them, money doesn't flow. Here's how the bank failures occurred. Depositors like you and I put our money into banks. These banks now have the ability to issue out loans to borrowers who come asking for money, and also to invest some of the money in the stock market or in other financial opportunities. However, when the Depression hit and the stock market collapsed, many banks lost some of their money, and borrowers could no longer pay back their debts. Meaning when the depositors returned to the bank asking for their money back, the bank had to close, and depositors were left broke.
American cities were hit hard because the collapse of companies eliminated factory jobs. High unemployment in cities meant evictions, homelessness, and hunger. Families lived in parks and sewers and dug through the trash or begged to eat. High rates of homelessness in cities forced some to live in shanty towns. Families lived in little towns of makeshift shacks made of scrap materials. The hungry and unemployed resorted to selling whatever they could in order to make money. Some sold produce, while others sold their clothes and their cars just to survive.
At the outset of the Great Depression, there was no system of direct relief. Direct relief are cash payments or food provided to the poor by the government as a safety net. Some cities offered meager relief programs, but it wasn't enough and it was very scarce and hard to find. So families relied mostly on private charities. 2 types of charity provided to the poor during the Depression were bread lines and soup kitchens. It wasn't uncommon to see long lines of poor people waiting to receive food provided by a charity, or a shelter who offered free or low-cost food to the poor and the unemployed. The American spirit means surviving on your own, so many Americans had to swallow their pride because they actually needed this charity to survive.
The economic crisis of the Great Depression was compounded by a crisis in the farm sector known as the Dust Bowl. The Great Plains were left dry by heat, drought, and over-farming during World War I. Through overuse, farmers removed the prairie grass that protected the dry topsoil. Windstorms picked up the dry topsoil and carried it to the Atlantic Ocean. Farmers' land was literally blown away. With land unsuitable to farm and nothing left, farmers migrated west. Traveling on Route 66, hundreds of thousands of people looked for work as farmhands, trying to scrape by. Most of these Okies migrated to California. The story of Okies moving west during the Dust Bowl is the subject of Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath.
One of the saddest effects of the Great Depression was the strain that it placed on the American family. While the family was a source of unity for most, some families were torn apart. Many men simply couldn't cope with their failure to provide for their family, and they abandoned their family and ran away. Hundreds of thousands of these hobos lived under bridges, they rode trains, and they wandered the country looking for a new start. Women were forced to deal with no income and resorted to canning food, making clothes, and sticking to tight budgets to feed their families. American children faced malnutrition, cuts in school funding, and disease. Teenagers during the Great Depression either ran away from home or were sold off to other families. Many of these teenagers became what was known as the Wild Boys. The Wild Boys roamed the country looking for work, adventure, and escape. If it's difficult to understand just how horrible the Great Depression was, imagine the Great Recession and double it. For all Americans, the Great Depression was one of the darkest times of their lives, and there didn't seem to be any light at the end of the tunnel.